Now, you notice on the program, Sung Tai Han is the next candidate, but you see Brendan up there at the podium. He collaborated with Sung Tai on his research, but unfortunately, Sung Tai won some fellowship and was invited to do a presentation elsewhere, so could not be here today.
All right, you covered that ground. Yeah, so Sung Tai has been doing this work, or IGP has been doing this work with a couple of collaborators at the Incident and Emergency group, communications group at the IAEA. And that kind of informs this research that Sung Tai has been doing. And I'll do my best to cover it and get through your questions. So let's start by examining some perceived threats of generative AI and the disinformation campaigns. There's a growing concern of AI's potential to transform disinformation, specifically in the three areas of, next slide. Sorry, I don't have control here, right? Okay, thank you. So specifically in three areas: creation, dissemination, and persuasion, right? In terms of creation, the AI doomsayers are claiming that generative AI like GPT-4 can create disinformation at scale with little to no cost, potentially overwhelming audiences with false information. And that they fear that this could enable a diverse array of false information to be produced rapidly and cheaply. For dissemination, there's concern that AI's ability to spread disinformation faster, potentially reaching larger audiences in a short amount of time. For example, there are studies like that have looked at AI botnets like the Fox 8 network that is capable of rapidly spreading content across social media platforms. And then lastly, persuasion. Some research suggests that AI-generated content could be more plausible and harder to debunk than human-made content, making it more persuasive, although those are largely experimental studies right now. These capabilities definitely sound alarming, but our research is actually suggesting a different reality, and we believe that these threats may be overstated to some degree. So let's explore a little bit of that. So we conducted an in-depth study of disinformation in two nuclear emergencies.
Could you change the slide?
Zaporizhia, thank you. Zaporizhia in Ukraine and also Fukushima in Japan. So Sung Tai has looked at close to 600 instances of propaganda content across various platforms and languages. And he hasn't really found any substantial evidence of state actors leveraging generative AI to craft their disinformation narratives. Now, traditional media, what he does find is that traditional media remains the primary tool for propaganda. And state-owned media in Russia, Ukraine, China, South Korea, and Japan actively have been leveraging mainstream domestic media outlets for disinformation campaigns. He observed strategic uses of images, videos, and expert interviews, all designed to kind of persuade citizens about threats related to these nuclear facilities. And contrary to the fears, these sophisticated disinformation campaigns largely failed to alter people's perceptions or affect meaningful policy changes. For instance, the majority of Japanese citizens maintain their support for their government's Fukushima water release strategy, despite intensive disinformation campaigns from China and South Korea. And interestingly, we observed that more proactive use of AI, we've observed more proactive use of AI in combating disinformation than vice versa. For example, Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications is funding 6 different projects to combat AI-generated disinfo using AI-grounded technologies. Next slide. So our research highlights a critical aspect that is often overlooked in discussions about AI and disinformation. And that's the profound impact of context on the effectiveness of false narratives. And this context dependence really challenges the notion that AI-generated content alone can significantly alter public perception or policy. So pre-existing beliefs play a crucial role in how information is received and interpreted by people. People are more likely to accept information that aligns with their established views, regardless of its source or quality. In Zaporizhia, we observed that Ukrainians were predisposed to trust their own media's claims about Russia's responsibility, irrespective of the quality or the quantity of information that was being thrown at them. The credibility of sources often outweighs the actual content of the information. So our study saw how state-owned media in countries like Russia and Ukraine, China, South Korea, Japan leveraged their established credibility to disseminate disinformation effectively. And that the people's trust in familiar sources proved more influential than the sophistication or the volume of the content itself. So institutional trust is very important. It acts as a powerful buffer against disinformation. We found that strong belief in governmental institutions can make populations resistant to false narratives, even when they're faced with sophisticated disinformation campaigns. For instance, despite efforts to sway opinion, Japanese public sentiment remained largely supportive of their government with regard to the water release plan. So these findings suggest that the effectiveness of disinfo is not primarily determined by technological sophistication or the volume of the content. Instead, it's heavily influenced by the socio-cultural context. And I believe Andrew talked about that yesterday at length, right? Pre-existing beliefs also highly impacted, and the established trust in institutions and media sources. Next slide, please. So there's also a tendency to overestimate what Gen AI can do currently in terms of disinformation. AI has limited, and this is a moving target, obviously, but what we saw, AI has a limited contextual understanding. It struggles to grasp complex socioeconomic backgrounds and the historical contexts that are so important to shaping people's perceptions and mitigate kind of effective disinformation. For instance, in Fukushima, that involves a diverse range of stakeholders, geopolitical issues and historical distrust that AI systems don't really grasp fully, or at least when you put in prompts to ask questions about it, you don't get the full context. And in fact, Gen AI systems have demonstrated different capabilities regarding kind of understanding of cultural and political contexts. I think there was some work looking at comparing, say, Claude and ChatGPT in the Korean cultural and literature kind of different understandings of those corpus of data. So human intervention is definitely very much required still. AI can't autonomously track rapidly changing narratives or geopolitical circumstances. So we see that we show how continuous human input is really needed to keep pace with fast changing situations of conflict. So for instance, in Zaporizhia, we identified at least 8 major disinformation narratives over 2 years. And each of those required understanding kind of the changing military operations, political considerations and circumstances. And these narratives evolve quickly, right? Posing challenges for any AI platform to create up-to-date, relevant content without significant human input. For example, a claim about explosives on the rooftops at Zaporizhia persisted for really only 2 months before it was being replaced by other new narratives about the perceived threat. AI systems definitely struggle to do this autonomously, to track and respond to such rapid changes that are occurring without humans actually intervening and guiding them. So these limitations suggest that AI's role in creating sophisticated disinformation is maybe less significant than often feared. So there's often an overemphasis on capabilities where AI excels. For instance, AI's ability to produce and spread large volumes of content rapidly. However, however, this focus overlooks two critical factors that our research has shown to be more influential. And that's the established credibility and the primary tools for shaping opinion. So I talked a little bit about established credibility earlier, but it's these traditional media outlets that retain higher credibility to long and have established trust mechanisms. And these mechanisms of trust and reputation are not easily replicated by AI or AI generated content. And this gives an example. I don't think this was Gen AI generated, but this is kind of gives you an idea of the ridiculous kind of stuff that is out there. A false news site that is promoting that Zelensky purchased Hitler's parade car. But that's, when you start to think about what was going on in Zaporizhia over the course of the conflict, seeing stuff like this just seems kind of farcical and not very influential. So it's this established trust that I was talking about with existing mechanisms of media platforms that gives content, whether it's true or false, a significant advantage in terms of believability. And equally important are the primary tools for shaping opinion. State-owned media and established channels remain the go-to sources, and we're not the first people to see this. Leonard Marshmeyer has got some work looking at the Ukraine conflict, where people rely on local papers and local media authorities to gain, the most insights into what's actually happening. So it's worth noting, I think, the potential risk to credibility. So using AI-generated content could potentially undermine the credibility of these media sources. So state actors really have little incentive to risk their media's existing credibility by introducing potentially detectable AI-generated content. That risk of being caught using artificial content far outweighs the potential benefits that they might gain by increasing disinformation content using Gen AI. Next slide. So it's crucial to really look at the evolving landscape of countermeasures against AI-generated disinformation as well. And there's a lot of activity that often goes overlooked in these discussions about the threat of generative AI and disinformation. I mean, the regulatory environment is very complex and plays a significant role in shaping social media, obviously, and their operations. So 2 examples, for instance, in China, AI companies have to select keywords to flag unsafe content, and they have to create prompts that actually test a lot of the AI platforms that are being used for rule violations. Similarly, Japan is mandating AI developers to create technologies that detect AI gen content and identify its provenance. AI detection models represent another crucial safeguard designed specifically for detecting and flagging and countering disinformation. Companies like Logically and NewsGuard are leveraging AI Gen AI to identify patterns associated with false information. Logically system, for instance, uses NLP to understand the context and prioritize content for human fact checkers to then review. And any benefits of the speed of AI really affects both sides of the equation, both the adversary and the counter adversary. So international cooperation is definitely growing in response to these challenges. And during the Hiroshima G7 summit, nations agreed to jointly counteract the use of Gen AI in disinformation, highlighting a collective resolve to address this issue. Although I will say that the interactions beyond the states with the platforms, there's still a lot of unseen kind of governance that seemingly is happening. Proactive measures by tech companies add another layer of protection. AI developers are implementing safeguards and ethical guidelines, and for instance, model providers do a lot of red teaming. They implement stricter access controls and usage restrictions, that type of thing, for AI models to prevent their misuse. Next slide. So in summary, our research findings prompt a critical kind of reassessment of the perceived threat of generative AI in disinfo campaigns. In the creation stage, AI shows limited capability in crafting contextually relevant disinformation without significant human intervention. Our study of ZNPP and Fukushima incidents found really no evidence of state actors employing generative AI for disinformation. The complexity of these situations involving rapidly changing geopolitical contexts and cultural nuances that possesses significant challenges for Gen AI systems. Dissemination, the spread of AI-generated content faces constraints from evolving content moderation and regulatory environments. We saw that traditional media channels and state-operated social media accounts remain the primary disseminators of disinformation. The established credibility of these sources proved more effective than the potential volume or speed offered by AI-enabled distribution. And in terms of persuasion, AI-generated disinformation demonstrates limited persuasive power. And that's largely due to AI's inability to grasp the full cultural nuances and higher trust that's placed in traditional media. And our research found that the effectiveness of disinformation campaigns in these two cases really depended on more pre-existing beliefs and source credibility. So these findings overall suggest that while AI definitely possesses potential risks, its current impact on disinformation campaigns may be less severe than initially feared. And particularly in high stakes scenarios like nuclear emergencies. I know that came up yesterday. People were talking about information, where people source their information. So the human elements of trust, cultural understanding, and established credibility continue to play a far more significant role and than the effectiveness in the effectiveness of disinformation and technological change. Okay.
Well, thank you for having me. I don't have any slides, so I'm going to be sitting and going over this the old-fashioned way. I'm going to be talking about what the U.S. Supreme Court said this July regarding the First Amendment issues surrounding the use of both algorithms and AI tools when it comes to moderating content on social media platforms. Before going there, I want to give you 3 big points to keep in mind. And these 3 big points hopefully will be helpful when we get to the key case today, which is Moody versus NetChoice. And that's the Supreme Court decision I'm going to be focusing on primarily. So the first big point is that the First Amendment generally protects the speech and editorial rights of private individuals and businesses against censorship by governmental entities. And editorial rights is really what we're going to be focusing on today, the ability of platforms to moderate content using algorithms and AI tools. The second big picture is that the First Amendment protects not only the right to speak, but the right not to speak, the right not to be compelled by the government to speak. And that's going to be very important here because we're going to see statutes from Florida and Texas compelling platforms to host content and speakers to which they object. So keep that in mind. And the third big point is that the First Amendment law evolves incrementally in step-by-step fashion, particularly when fleshing out principles about new technologies. So ultimately, don't expect any big picture answers or solutions today from the Supreme Court. It will evolve over time. Just to kind of get to the short story there. With this in mind, here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to talk about an overview of Moody. I'm going to give you the facts, what's kind of going on. Then I'm going to move into what we call the First Amendment medium-specific jurisprudence. In other words, each medium and control affects how much speech gets on that medium. And then I'm going to talk about the court's remarks about YouTube's recommendation algorithms in a 2023 case called Twitter versus Taamneh about matching people up, and in this case, matching people up with videos of terrorist activities and whether that sparked an attack in a Turkish nightclub. And then finally, I'm going to dig into Moody and what the justices said regarding the relationship between platforms' use of algorithms and AI tools to moderate content and the First Amendment editorial rights to do that, whether they exist. So let me give you what's going on in Moody. There's also a companion case involving Texas called Paxton, but we'll just call them Moody today because I'm always very moody. Moody versus NetChoice, it involves the First Amendment editorial rights of social media platforms to decide for themselves how to moderate, including via algorithm and AI tools, content. So at issue are Florida and Texas statutes that collectively compel platforms to host viewpoints and speakers against their will, while simultaneously dictating how that content, again via algorithms, is curated and presented to users. The statutes thereby interfere with the platform's ability to enforce their own policies, their own terms of use or community standards or guidelines about acceptable content. So what does Florida do? I always think we should have, that hashtag a Florida man. We should also have hashtag a Florida law. We should have a Florida law. Florida bars deplatforming candidates running for public office, state or local office. You can't deplatform them. It also prohibits platforms from applying and using post-prioritization or shadow banning algorithms. So where they're raised or lower, how it's presented or selected, by or about a user who the platform knows is a candidate. So any content from that candidate or any content about it, you can't use algorithms to raise or lower it. Additionally, Florida's law provides that a platform may not take any action to censor, deplatform, or shadow ban a journalistic enterprise. So if on a Twitter or X now or Facebook, you have a journalistic enterprise, a news outlet, you can't ban it, deplatform it, raise it, or lower it. Texas, what does it do? It generally bans viewpoint-based discrimination. You can't censor a user based upon their viewpoint or who they are. Hateful viewpoints, therefore, cannot be suppressed because a hateful viewpoint is the opposite of a happy viewpoint or a good viewpoint, right? And so you can't suppress hate speech basically under Texas statute. It does make carve-outs for censorship, but it doesn't do so when it applies to sexist, racist, anti-LGBTQ+ viewpoints or religious bigotry. Platforms can't remove such valueless, hateful speech unless the post directly incite criminal activity or include a direct threat of violence. So do these statutes violate the First Amendment? The Supreme Court punts on that issue and unfortunately never addresses the merits. It sent the cases back to the lower courts because it was unclear all of the applications basically of these statutes. They were drafted so broadly. So what the lower courts now have to do, the 11th Circuit in Florida and the 5th Circuit, which sweeps up Texas, they have to look at the full set of applications of each law and decide whether the unconstitutional applications substantially outweigh the constitutional ones. So there's a lot of fact finding the lower courts have to do. What's really the scope and coverage of these statutes? We don't know. The Supreme Court said, we're not going to guess here. We're going to send them back to you, and you got to tell us that. So some justices, however, made important statements that might affect whether using algorithms to moderate content merits First Amendment protection. So we'll get to those. My brief setup to this is what I call this medium-specific First Amendment jurisprudence, that the nature of the medium on which speech is conveyed affects how much protection that speaker will have. So this may be review for some of you. Again, the scope of editorial freedom, because that's what we're really thinking about, to moderate content then hinges partly on the medium. So editors of print newspapers receive maximum First Amendment protection. Supreme Court told us this in a 1974 case, so 50 years ago, called Miami Herald Publishing Company versus Tornillo. Said a newspaper is more than a passive receptacle for news, comment, and advertising. Choice is up for editors where that material goes and what goes into the newspaper. So according to Tornillo, what was going on, it held unconstitutional a Florida right of reply statute that, get this, compelled newspapers to print the replies of public office candidates that the newspapers had criticized. You get free of charge, same space, same location. If you're attacked, ostensibly this expands the marketplace of ideas, but it doesn't sound like a lot what's going on now. Florida says you can't deplatform candidates running for public office because we want people to know what those candidates are saying. So compelling such access under that right of reply statute that Florida had, you're saying you're compelling, giving them space in your newspaper, violated the First Amendment free press guarantee. How is this important? In Moody, Justice Alina Kagan, writing for herself and 5 others, so it's a majority, dubbed Tornillo, and it is Tornillo, not Tornillo, the seminal case, not like the Florida State School, involving the question whether ordering a party to post something, provide a forum for, implicates the First Amendment. So print gets the most. What gets the least? Broadcasters. They get the least amount of protection due to the antiquated notions of spectrum scarcity. What happens when it comes to cable system operators? They're somewhere in between. Cable system operators, we don't have the spectrum scarcity issue, but they have what we call bottleneck monopoly or gatekeeper control over what flows through that cable package. And so they're somewhere in between when we think about how we stack up those media. So then we get to the big question, what about internet speakers? And in 1997, in a case called Reno versus ACLU, the United States Supreme Court said that speakers on the internet internet get full First Amendment protection. There's no need to qualify their rights of First Amendment protection. So if we think about that, then social media platforms, when they engage in expressive activities, should be afforded the same amount of First Amendment protection as editors of old school newspapers, whether it's done by algorithms or by humans, right? Indeed, Kagan explained for the 6 justices in Moody that, quote, expressive activity includes presenting a curated compilation of speech originally created by others. And that's really what's going on. Newspapers tend to create most of their own content, right? Platforms don't. But again, what she says is there that, again, that expressive activity includes presenting a curated compilation of speech originally created by others. She added that Texas's law, that's the one that prevents viewpoint-based discrimination. At least as it applies to, and this is the good news really for the platforms, Facebook's news feed, so Facebook's news feed and YouTube's homepage, quote, prevents exactly the kind of editorial judgments this court has previously held to receive First Amendment protection. So in other words, Tornillo's principles apply today. It prevents a platform, Texas statute, from compiling the third-party speech it wants in the way it wants, and thus from offering expressive products that most reflects their own viewpoints. Whose own viewpoint? The platform's own viewpoint. We ban hate speech, we ban violence, we ban this. That's our view, and we only allow this type of speech. And so Texas's law prohibits that. So the majority agreed that, quote, curated feeds offered by the largest and most paradigmatic social media platforms are sheltered by the First Amendment. What it didn't get into, and this is why it sent the cases back to the lower courts, was, do they apply to things like Etsy? What about Uber? Any kind of things where you can actually make comments on any social media platforms. Some justices expressed qualms, however, about blanket constitutional protection for algorithmic implemented decisions, and I will get there. So let me get into the Tomney case, which is next, the 2023 decision. In 2023, the Supreme Court considered whether Twitter, Facebook, and Google could be held civilly liable for aiding and abetting an ISIS terrorist attack at a Turkish nightclub that injured plaintiffs. The plaintiffs alleged that the defendants, all the social media platforms I mentioned, knew that ISIS used their platforms to recruit terrorists and raise money, but failed to take action. The court rejected the plaintiff's claim, so the Supreme Court rejects that claim. The nexus is just too far attenuated between feeding people videos based upon what they've looked at in the past and what they like, and then feeding them that terrorist video or some recruitment video. That's too attenuated from the attack at the Turkish nightclub. There's a long distance. The court examined recommendation algorithms that match content and advertisements with users, quote, based on a wide range of information about the user, the advertisement, and the content being viewed. Writing for unanimous court, Justice Clarence Thomas suggested a great distance separates human action from algorithmic work. So this is the kind of the not good news from Thomas. But you think of Thomas and Gorsuch and Alito, they're kind of out there on one side. Quote from Thomas, as presented here, the algorithms appear agnostic as to the nature of the content, matching any content, including ISIS content, with any user who is more likely to view that content. The fact that these algorithms matched ISIS content with some users thus does not convert defendants' passive assistance, and that's important, into active aiding and abetting. Once the platform and sorting tool algorithms were up and running, defendants at most allegedly stood back and watched. So although this emphasis on passivity and just standing back and watching was good news in this case because it goes against actively aiding and abetting, overall, it's really not very good news in terms of how Thomas is thinking about what algorithms do. You basically set them up, you let them run, and we don't do anything. So Thomas added, there is no allegation that the platforms here do more than transmit information by billions of people, most of whom use the platforms for interactions that once took place via mail, on the phone, or public areas. He wrote that recommendation algorithms are merely part of the infrastructure. So this is part of the plumbing basically going on. And you can see where he's going on this. That all makes platforms seem like dumb pipes or common carriers. Telephone companies rather than companies that actively exercise editorial control and content meriting First Amendment protection. So now we get into Moody, the big case of the day. So what do the justices say about algorithms and AI tools in moderating content? So boding well for the view that algorithmic usage to moderate content does not diminish First Amendment protection. Justice Kagan wrote that, and this is her language, platforms write algorithms to implement their community standards and guidelines regarding prioritization of content. So she understands that this is a human judgment back there, and the algorithm is merely the tool that it implements and carries it out. Again, Justice Kagan said a couple of years ago that we're not exactly the 9 greatest experts on how the internet works. So you're having to get inside their heads and what they're thinking about this. So she seemingly recognized that humans then create algorithms as tools to enforce, or in her words, to implement at scale editorial decisions and, quote, user agnostic judgments made by the platform's personnel. And she was joined here by 4 other justices. Justice Jackson did not join in that part. Similar good news for the constitutional editorial rights of platforms using algorithms to implement community standards is in Justice Barrett's concurrence. She writes, assume that human beings decide to remove posts promoting a particular political candidate, if humans do that, or advocating some position on a public health issue. If they create an algorithm to help them identify and delete that content, the First Amendment protects their exercise of editorial judgment and control, even if the algorithm does most of the deleting. But then troubling here for platforms and editorial rights was Kagan's statement, we do not deal here with feeds whose algorithms respond solely to how users act online. They're simply responding. They don't implement their own community standards or guidelines. It's simply, here's what we want, and we're going to feed you that content. So this intimates, as I look at a key dichotomy between platforms using algorithms to implement user agnostic community standards, their own terms of service and terms of guidelines about what's acceptable on the one hand, versus algorithms that colloquially put simply give people what they want on the other hand. So maybe the court is kind of focusing on something about that. So the implication that the latter usage merits downgraded First Amendment protection, however, ignores the fact that I would call such populist algorithms were designed by humans in the first place. They're already making editorial judgments about what people want, and we're going to feed you that content. Kagan's concern also tracks Justice Barrett's sentiment in her concurrence here. What if a platform's algorithm just presents automatically to each user what the algorithm thinks the user will like, content similar to posts which the user has previously engaged with? The First Amendment implications of the Florida and Texas laws might be different for that kind of thing. So the fact here that they also took into account the community standards and guidelines is very important. Barrett also considered the possibility about using artificial intelligence tools, which is the topic of this, to remove content that sometimes might become too attenuated. This is her concern. From human decisions to earn constitutional protection. So if we use AI tools, does it now become too far removed from the human editorial control and discretion that the First Amendment protects? So she asked this question: what if a platform's owners hand the reins over to an AI tool and ask it simply to remove hateful content? If the AI relies on large language models to determine what is hateful and should be removed, as a human being with First Amendment rights made an inherently expressive choice not to propound a particular point of view. Again, now we're letting the AI decide what's hateful speech and what to remove it is that, and she's suggesting it may be too far removed. As I suggest in the paper that I wrote for this, that her hesitation reflects this usual desire to avoid broad pronouncements. So thus for Barrett, I think any First Amendment analysis is going to be fact intensive, right? What specifically does this algorithm or this AI tool do, and how does it work? Justice Jackson echoes that similar sentiment about getting down to the facts and granularity. Courts must make sure they carefully parse not only what entities are regulated, but how the regulated activities actually function. So she wants to know, how do these algorithms really work before we decide whether we're going to vest them with protection? So some kind of clarity and transparency. Other factors that might affect this, and this is, I think, very important, Barrett identified other factors. Although not naming TikTok, she pondered whether it would matter if a foreign-owned or controlled, quote, corporation employs Americans to develop and implement content moderation algorithms at the direction of foreign executives. She noted that foreign persons and corporations abroad do not have First Amendment rights. Basically, she's teeing it up that that's not going to be protected. So the greatest skepticism, though, about the use of algorithms, and I'm approaching the end here, was expressed by Justice Samuel Alito, along with Clarence Thomas and Gorsuch, or ATG, as I like to think of the three of them. So Alito referenced using secret algorithms, and so he's very bothered by this lack. He doesn't know what's going on. He says secret algorithms in the content moderation process, indicating the greater transparency is very important for him. And then he also pushed back on the Kagan majority. Alito wrote that taking NetChoice at its word, NetChoice is the trade association for all the internet groups like Facebook. The majority says that the platform's use of algorithms to enforce their expressive standards is per se expressive. But the platforms have refused to disclose how these algorithms were created and how they actually work. He lamented lacking facts to confirm whether they are in fact expressive. So this suggests that Alito does not view, again with the other two justices, as implementing the expressive editorial judgments of humans who create them, but is simply exercising their own independent editorial judgment free from any human involvement. Like Barrett, he expressed reservations about extending First Amendment protection, quote, when AI algorithms, as he called them, do the moderating. And here's what he said: many of the biggest platforms are beginning to use AI algorithms to help moderate content. And when AI algorithms make a decision, even the researchers and programmers creating them don't really understand why the models they have built make the decisions they make. In other words, it's a black box. He says, we don't even know how they're coming up with this at the end. That's his concern. So are such decisions then equally expressive as if they were made by humans? Should we at least think about that? That's his words. Those are his words in this case. So in sum, the justice is thinking here about the relationship between content moderation, algorithms, and AI tools, and extending the First Amendment protection of editorial control and freedom and autonomy to them is in what I would call an unsettled stage of fermentation. Think about that wine out there in Napa or Sonoma in those big barrels sitting there for several years. And you mix up some stainless steel and you're moving up. No, but so it's still in the stage of fermentation. Clearly, justices want at least some greater transparency from platforms about how their algorithms work, what they actually do. Think about Alito's secret algorithms and Justice Jackson, how they actually function. Additionally, there's some doubts whether turning it over, as it were, in Justice Barrett's reference, handing the reins over to an AI tool in Alito's statements when an AI algorithm makes a decision. So bottom line, these cases are going to percolate back up to the United States Supreme Court, most likely. By that stage, then, what the lower courts will have done, hopefully, will give them more facts about the scope and their applications. And then when they come up, the Supreme Court will make some bigger decisions. But the bottom line is I don't see any large pronouncements here by the court. So.
Thank Dr. Milton and Dr. Karim for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you all and be outside of the computer science, the bubble of the computer science community for 2 days. So I mainly work on NLP and language models and making them more accessible to people with diverse backgrounds and making them more safe. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit of our work on measuring cultural biases in language models. I won't go into like technical details, but show you some examples of where things can go wrong and why current evaluation of language model has become a little bit useless and what we should be doing instead. So there's always multilingual language models that are being released every day now. And all of these models usually evaluate on several benchmarks, and then they just try to get +1 or +2, and then they're very happy. And we released this model, which is really great. But these benchmarks have become useless for many reasons. The first of which is data contamination, because these models are trained on basically the whole internet in a way where they've already seen the test set of these benchmarks when they're being trained. The next problem is that most of these benchmarks don't really help us in measuring what we want to measure. So if we have a math benchmark and we get like 90% on that math benchmark, it doesn't really mean that this model is able to reason about math. And there's a recent paper that's released 3 days ago that shows if you give it the same math problem that it gets 90% on, and you just add a statement to this math problem, like, by the way, the Wi-Fi password is GT visitor, it cannot solve the problem anymore. The accuracy goes from 90% to like maybe 20%. So we shouldn't take these benchmarks very seriously. What we want to focus I think what we need to focus more on is we need to evaluate on like whether these models that we're releasing are safe, are less harmful, and are accessible to different backgrounds. So, for example, if you give models this Arabic prompt, where you give it like a sentence after this Islamic prayer, I'm going with my friends to drink, and ask it like, can you give me completions to this? It will give you something like wine and whiskey and tequila and stuff. And so you can feel the AGI in these examples here. And so we need like ways to evaluate whether models can understand context properly. And what we do here in this research particularly, we introduce a new benchmark to measure biases in language models, and we call it CAML. So basically what it does is it helps us evaluate how models process entities that exhibit cultural variation, like people's names, where Fatima is like an Arab name and Jessica is a Western name. Models are gonna be processing these things all the time. We need to make sure they're not sensitive to like changes in these named entities. So we collect like 20,000 entities via an automatic approach. I won't go into the details, but we capture like the long tail rare stuff and the very iconic things, for example, for male names. And it also has natural context that we also construct, which help us test entities in like natural context, which we obtain from like real Twitter data. But basically, I just want to show you like what results we get when we evaluate models. First, whether they can understand cultural context. So if you give it something like this, my grandma is Arab, and for dinner she always makes us. We want to check like whether the model will give a higher likelihood for lasagna over an actual Arab dish. And so we have this likelihood-based measure where 100% means it's really bad. But we see like for a wide range of different models, they always struggle and give a higher probability for like an inappropriate to the context entity that associate with Western culture instead, even if these models are just trained on Arabic data. We also examine whether they will frame different people that associate with different cultures differently when they generate text. So for example, if you ask it to tell me a story, generate a story about some character, if you give it an Arab name like Al-As, it will always tell you like this person was really very poor and grew up in a modest family and his life was really a battle. But if you give it Philippe, it will tell you like Philippe was really popular and intelligent and things like that. And this is a quantification of like the odds of models like GPT-4 will have like 7 times more chance of describing a person that has a Western name as being popular, or 4 times more likely to stereotype them as wealthy. But if it's generating a story about an Arab character, it will likely describe him as poor. So it doesn't treat names very in a fair manner. And this could extend to any type of generation that where you have like a named entity in it. So maybe people use language models today to generate recommendation letters about people. So if it's a guy or a girl, then they will write the recommendation letter in very different ways, which I don't think we should be using models for that. But like these things can happen in any generation setting. And even if you like ask the model 100, 1,000,000 times, are you biased? Are you racist? And it tells you no, it doesn't mean like when it actually generates something that the way it behaves will not align with the direct answer that it gives you, that I'm not stereotypical or whatever. The last thing we test is whether they treat entities fairly when we use them on like tests that people usually use when deploying models for different things. Like, for example, sentiment classification. If you give it something like, I met a person named Milton, is really cool, and you ask it like, what's the sentiment here? It's obviously like positive. But if you change the name to like Kareem, it'll give you like and so we quantify this more closely. We use the benchmark to create like a very large test set, basically the same thing, but we swap the entities. We analyze false negative differences. What you can see here in red is that these models, they're more likely to predict false negative sentiment when you have like Arab culture related terms in any sentence that you give it, which is you don't want it to be sensitive to these changes because that doesn't really make sense, but it happens for like all models and it's like really bad. The other thing is that these models can also better detect named entities that are Western and would not be able, for example, to detect in an Arab name in a sentence or an Arab location. And this is bad because like sometimes we need detectors for names or for locations for good purposes, like some of the work we do in the lab here, trying to detect self-disclosures by people, like when they disclose names of people they know or like locations they've been to. If these people are like from different cultures, this tool won't really work well for them, and they will less be able to benefit from like privacy protection tools, basically. And finally, I just added a few slides based on like the listening to all of your discussions yesterday and today about what we should be doing to govern AI-based technology. First, from a scientific perspective, what we need to do is push more research on more useful safety evaluation benchmarks to help us not measure just like cultural biases, but also whether these models will be less able to like be used to generate misinformation or do bad things like that. There's a lot of academic research that shows different types of biases in models, but almost none of it gets integrated into the standard evaluation of the new systems and new models that are always being released. Because I don't think like Meta will want to show you like we released Llama 4 and it does really bad on all of these safety benchmarks. But we need to force kind of these evaluations into these new models and also develop these type of evaluations and also a more serious type of red teaming procedure to deal with implicit harms, because the way they currently do red teaming is mostly for explicit type of harms. Like they don't want the model to be able to help you to answer the question of like, how can I build a bomb or something, or how can I kill myself? But we need to focus on more implicit harms. Like we need to red team the model to be able, for example, to reason of whether this thing that I'm generating, like you can ask ChatGPT right now, generate an article about whoever saying whatever and doing whatever, and then you can use this to like spread misinformation. But we should red team models to be able to reason like whether this can potentially be like risky, and whether I should respond to this type of query or not, where the harm isn't really explicit. And finally, I think we should think about different modalities in different ways and just think about the usefulness versus the risk trade-off of the use case that we will use an AI model for. For example, in language models that are text-based only, they're really useful for like assistive writing and coding and all of that. But it's really easy to use them to spread misinformation. And they have implicit stereotypes, which I don't think are gonna go away because this is a statistical model and will always learn these associations. But we should control what use cases they should be allowed to be integrated into or not for automation purposes. And considering of like whether there's sensitivity to like different type of entities and stuff like that. But for example, for a different modality like speech, like for cases like voice cloning models, like I don't think that your life will be miserable if there's no voice cloning model available for you to use. But there's paid services online that would offer this, and you can just use it in a matter of minutes. So if it was up to me, I would make a voice cloning service illegal. But this is basically my thoughts about like governing these technologies. Thank you.
We've heard some very interesting perspectives, starting with Sante and Brendan, which is at a high level that some of the threats of disinformation may have been blown out of proportion. These two use cases, at least, where you guys have looked at the data. And then we've heard that some of the concerns with the Supreme Court has been delegated to the lower courts. It's going to percolate. It's going to be more data sent upwards. And sure in the real world empirically they'll have more data and then we'll see what happens perhaps. I don't know if you have any sense of how long this is gonna take, Clay.
It'll be a while, I think, on this because they're back in two different courts. And really it's a massive procedure because they've got to figure out all the potential applications of these two statutes, which especially the Florida one's drafted very broadly. And then what they're going to have to do is weigh and balance. The question here is whether these laws is getting illegal but are facially invalid, and to have facial invalidation, meaning the entire statute on its face by its text and its terms is unconstitutional. You weigh, are there a substantial number of unconstitutional applications, those that would violate the First Amendment rights of editorial control and autonomy, including via algorithm usage? And do they substantially outweigh the constitutional uses? In other words, there's a denominator and numerator, and you're basically comparing these two numbers. And if there's a substantial number of unconstitutional applications that outweigh the constitutional, the laws would be struck down. But then if they are, let's say, and the Fifth Circuit's probably not going to strike down Texas, it's very conservative in some ways, and the 11th Circuit had a straightforward First Amendment analysis, they will still come back up to the Supreme Court. So what I was trying to tease out was some of the points about how Coney Barrett is suspect about the about the AI tools actually handing the reins over. If you define hate speech for us, AI tool, and then you go and you find it, is that too far attenuated from human judgment? So if you think about the big picture, I guess, and I'll stop here, is like the newspaper editor, that's a human determining what goes into that page, right? That news page. Now we're saying if you have an AI tool, okay, but that AI tool is implementing the human judgment. That's one thing. But now then the algorithm. But if we get to an AI tool that's deciding for itself somewhere down the line what's hate speech and then removing it, is that too far removed? And so that seems to be the big concern, along with what I know we talked about transparency yesterday, but Alito, the secret algorithms, they really don't know what's going on.
I also definitely want us to talk about some of the cultural issues that Tara highlighted, but I missed the sequence here, but let's go with Andreas, Devin, and Richard.
Just a quick comment for Tarek's work. This is really fascinating, and the thing for me was eye-opening because I think often we hear like those phrases, "Oh, there's like fairness and bias," but I don't think I know those standard examples, but this was actually super interesting, to showcase what some of those issues are. So thank you so much for doing that. And then a quick follow-on question: are there independent model evaluation labs out there that do this type of work that you're doing, or how? Or the other related question: how much does it cost to do an evaluation like this? I know this is academic research, but I'm just curious because I guess we need more of that.
Yeah, I think it costs a lot of human effort to come up with the right evaluation that you need to do. And it also costs a lot of computational effort to evaluate these models because most labs can't afford computation. But we're doing it here at Georgia. We're the ones doing it. But unfortunately, there isn't a lot of push towards these type of evaluations, and most research is focusing on making language models better at reasoning or better at. I don't think that's the priority for us right now. Whatever reasoning means, I think there should be more push by government funding to fund these types of evaluation and research to be better able to evaluate these models, these things, not just for cultural biases, but also for different type of problems like these.
Just very quick, Brendan, great stuff. I'm thinking you'll have Ankler's book on this. Maybe not. It's network propaganda. Did you guys look at that at all?
Sanktai has it.
Yeah, because it just fits so well. So I think it's great that people are extending the point of humans have to be actually at the core of amplifying the crazy is basically what I think the takeaway was. Right. It was showing that it's all out at the fringe. So very cool. That's really all I have there. Clay, I think one thing that you're highlighting is oddly the logic from the Supreme Court sounds like it wants human in the loop in some very vague way, with a deep misunderstanding that humans weren't in the loop with algorithms to begin. But boy, just what we've been talking about all the time in terms of but once we slap AI, which by the way, some of you know, since we're some old codders too, right? I think if you hear AI, just hear .com. It's about as broadly useless as it used to be. But thank you for explaining that the logic is tied up in misunderstanding, machines were already learning. And I saw your talk earlier, when you gave it to the ML group, so, but great stuff, great stuff.
Andrew?
Yeah, Clay, that was fascinating to hear that. I kind of had a similar thought of, well, about how far this idea of like the delegation of editorial control goes to an algorithmic system. And there's a really wonderful paper by John Zerilli and University that kind of talks about this in the public sector context, about how public sector law in the United States, administrative law, prevents you from delegating your authority to another entity. So if you're a sheriff, for example, or a judge, you can't delegate that authority to a random person. And this raises huge questions then of like, where's that line drawn between if you're using a system as a quote co-pilot, but we know so much about algorithmic bias, complacency bias. Where do you draw that line about it, or about the tool, the LLM being responsible for creating a decision? And again, as somebody used to work in trust and safety with algorithm systems, it's so messy because like we do use AI systems, LLMs, to sort of give ideas of like what are other alternatives or of racist slur or kind of a contextual based slur that might arise that like the human hasn't chosen. It's in the spirit of a policy, but if you get down to like the specific thing that you're moderating or amplifying or de-amplifying, it is a lot of machine generated content. So that's a really interesting place they're going with it. Brendan, I had a question for you as well about sort of just this question about speech disinformation. And, I think Tarek kind of raised this as well in your really brilliant presentation about. To me, that seems like audio feels like a very different sort of beast. I think when we talk about the way in which that is being used for disinformation and for scamming. In the UK, we had a very notable case of the fabrication of our now Prime Minister's voice to present. He was kind of essentially defaming members of the staff and members of his constituency. It took about 48 hours for that to be cleared up that it was confirmed to be fake. We also know that obviously speech and audio disinformation is being used currently to scam all kinds of businesses and bypass or banking voice verification systems. So I'm just curious if that's a specific use case that you think might be different here, or if you think that kind of falls in the same rubric, the same sort of evidence you're finding here.
Yeah, no, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly that's a threat we've observed here in the US, right? The election Biden thing in Vermont or New Hampshire. But that wasn't a modality that we've observed in these two particular cases. And I don't know if that's because it's not, maybe that's a very targeted type of threat, right? And this is more of kind of like mass media kind of mindset, trying to shape perception and belief at scale. I'm not really sure, but it's an interesting question.
We have a question from the audience, and I'll go to Milton next.
Carmen was.
Carmen next.
Thank you. Just a couple quick clarifying questions for you, Clay. So is there an injunction on the laws? Like as the litigation is ongoing, are the laws being enforced or are they?
Right, there is an injunction on it.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So the lower courts actually, so Texas, they actually, even though the Fifth Circuit upheld Texas's law, it issued an injunction until the court ruled on it. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I was curious that you didn't include Murphy v. Missouri in your discussion. Do you think it's not?
Yeah, so Murphy versus Missouri is the jawboning case by way of background. So that's the Biden administration telling social media platforms. I didn't focus on that because it didn't deal with algorithms necessarily as I saw it. Murphy versus Missouri is, again, the Biden administration officials going to social media platforms, the big ones, and saying, this is a false narrative, take down anti-COVID vaccine material. And then the Supreme Court, again, it goes up to the United States Supreme Court. And again, the Supreme Court basically punts on the substantive issue and says that the plaintiffs, Missouri, Louisiana, and 5 individuals did not have standing to file that lawsuit. And again, you get Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch saying, no, one of them does. Jill Hines, a woman from Louisiana, has standing to sue. And they would have said that indeed the Biden administration violated the First Amendment rights by coercing and compelling the social media platforms to take it down. Because typically social media platforms are private entities. There's no First Amendment issue. But the real question is, are they being coerced and compelled to take down? If so, then they become state actors, essentially. And therefore, they can violate the First Amendment rights. So the plaintiffs were determined by the majority, and Justice Coney Barrett wrote that opinion, that they did not have standing. So we don't know the answer. But I didn't address it because of the algorithm question.
Right,
Oh,
it really didn't implicate AI that much.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was more, they would have emails, they'd send back and forth emails, or there'd be a press conference and something like that, but yeah.
And then for you, Brendan, given your argument, what do you think is the consequence of, because especially in the last panel, we talked about how there is a broad focus on misinformation, disinformation. So what do you think are then the consequences of these, to the extent that there are regulations or attempts at making companies do something about misinformation, disinformation? What do you think the consequences of those will be if, as you said, they're not that big of a deal, or they're not the big deal that people think they are?
Consequences. So I guess it kind of. So one thing I didn't talk about was, we've also explored, well, what might be the governance mechanism by which you can deal with, because I don't want to dismiss the threat entirely, but we think it's been overblown quite a bit. Nonetheless, we will have instances where you have this information being disseminated, it may involve generative AI, and may need, and one aspect I didn't talk too much about, but the transnational aspect of disinformation, particularly in the Fukushima case, where you're seeing advocacy groups try and shape narratives occurring in the media in other countries. And so you need a coordination kind of mechanism amongst platforms, private platforms, to deal with this stuff, but to also recognize the expression issues that are on the table. And so without some sort of kind of non-state-led governance structure that helps platforms coordinate to deal with this problem, I think we're going to continually run into problems like what you were just talking about, where we potentially have job owning going on in the US and other places, and end up in situations where legitimate speech, let's say, for instance, legitimate debate around Fukushima and the water release treatment plan gets censored. So.
All right, we have a question from the audience and then move to the next. Hi, I'm a PhD student here. Really great panel. This question is sort of more for Tarek and Clay. One of the things that came to mind as you were doing your presentations was Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is how different AI algorithms are incorporated into institutions, but they end up having bad knock-on effects that are unexpected. So I was wondering, what do you think is the optimal type of government intervention inside of those things, either from an institutional level or a more technical level? Because from a more technical level, you can try to solve these issues on the output level, on the back end. Or you could try to insert more synthetic data to try to balance out the bad context that the AI models are learning that are more discriminatory. But sometimes that could be more difficult. But then when you start tampering with things on the back end, on the output level, you don't necessarily know how the changes you're making are going to have more complex interactions because of the black box problems. So when you think about trying to solve these issues, is the optimal solution a human in the loop to incorporate into this decision-making process? Or is it better ways of going through different types of data? Thank you.
That's a great, go ahead.
Can I do a two-finger since my question was related to this, and I'll put my card down. My question was, do we have a responsibility to build aspirational tech? And it applies to, I was thinking about Tarek, your presentation, but it applies to the broader group, because part of what I mean by that is similar to your question, in the sense that most of these systems are designed to reflect the context of the data set that they're working from and the statistical accuracy from it, right? So any change in that, you're essentially changing the context by which you view that system, and you're maybe reducing accuracy. And often when I was doing this in the private sector, the feedback I would get was, well, in fact, if you look at, like, in this case, let's just hypothetically, in the case of the language, they would say, well, in fact, if you look at the Middle East compared to Western countries, they are often less economically well-resourced, so they would be more poor or modest compared to someone in the Western world. So this is an accurate statement. So, but that doesn't solve the bias and the perception issue. So I guess the question is related to this, like, do we have a responsibility to build aspirational technology, or does the government have to inspire some sort of aspirational technical development, or do we aim for accuracy and really land the context to as the disclaimer? I don't know. It's a question that I struggle with.
I mean, I think, the First Amendment's gonna push back on the government dictating what, how these systems work and the large language models for them. But I think that instance that Coney Barrett cited about hate speech, think about how difficult that would be. It depends upon what's been fed into that large language model and determine, what is hateful, what is not. And I think there's a large chance for bias in that, I think, because of how is it to determine that this speech is hateful or not? Do you want that human in there then to come along and say, no, the way this phrase is used in this context is really not hateful. It's used, if I'm using the N-word in one context, it may be hate speech, and another one, it might not be hate speech. So, I mean, I don't know I think it's a good point. Do we want some human in the loop? But again, it ignores the fact that the algorithm is created by humans in the first place, and the algorithm is doing the human's work.
Also ignores the scale problem.
It's scalability, yeah.
Tarek, maybe I misunderstood one of your figures, but it looked like there were actually models that performed rather well in some of the questions. They just didn't happen to be GPT, OpenAI. They were based maybe in the Middle East or something like that. So I would just add that the idea that maybe we should be fostering competing models, right? Because they use different kinds of data, they use different approaches, and they're contextually relevant.
That was
That would
kind of
be-
where I was gonna go with my comment. It's a very interesting interaction between your research and the discussion of algorithmic as a form of expression, right? Algorithmic discrimination. So and it relates to what Grace said too, because in terms of this aspirational thing, it's like, whose aspirations are we talking about, right? If we're talking about Google in California, they're already doing that, by the way. They have their whole fairness and machine learning. I tried very hard to get somebody from Google to show up here. I think they're a bit cagey, a little bit afraid to expose that sort of, but we're all familiar with this famous picture of the founding fathers that they generated and where they tried to impose diversity on the picture. It was inaccurate because they had like Asians and African Americans as among the founding fathers, but it was their attempt to be aspirational and fair, right? So what I think in terms of governance, we cannot avoid market governance in this case, competition. In effect, you're saying, and I like your idea of having better metrics, right? Or scientifically derived metrics in which people can base their choice on. But fundamentally, especially if we have government intervention, we're going to get the Chinese building models influenced by their states that put a positive spin on everything Chinese culture, right? And maybe the Middle East will develop, their own things that are a little bit denigrative of Israel, for example. And I think they have the right to do that, right? In fact, they can build their models and they can have their outputs and people can say, oh, that's biased or that's wrong. But there's no way that some world central authority is going to make all models non-discriminatory in some global contextless way. I just don't see how that could ever work. So I think we have to have essentially a choice and competition model for how content gets governed through these models, even though that will mean there will be really prejudicial and discriminatory people doing things out there. It's like they have to be combated with more speech, which is kind of the free speech.
Counter speech, yeah, counter speech. One humorous anecdote to that about it, how generative AI creates this founding fathers of all races, persuasions, genders and everything. The human side of that, the aspirational goal is I co-author a textbook for undergraduates. And for the first time, we have a DEI editor who went through and said that these names of these people in these real life cases are all males or they're all too white sounding. Can you change the names of these individuals? And we said, no, this is not a fictional book. I'm sorry, these are the names of the cases. So the human desire to create a more, it's not just the ChatGPT.
But it's not a fictional book, but in the United States, at least, you would say, okay, maybe the most popular name is Connor or something still, or something like whatever the most popular male name is. But we are, at least in the United States, we work to build a diverse. We like to say that we are welcoming of all immigrants and that we're building a diverse community. So why wouldn't we then also sort of
Great, I think he's talking about case.
There are cases there, they're actually.
The
these
actual
real decisions.
Real decision.
No, they really want
Right.
it.
Okay,
They
so
really
we're
want
talking
it.
the fictional case.
He's talking about
you could.
accuracy.
Yeah.
Right,
not
right, if in the
hypothetical.
act, in case you could.
What
Right,
Google
right.
was doing was saying.
Was
if-
changing the act, was
if-
like
If you ask
misrepresenting
about
fact.
CEOs, it may be statistically true that 80% of CEOs are male, but they're
Right.
going to show you lots of women in their search results, which is, again, their editorial decision, which I think they have the right to make. And if you don't like it, use some other search engine, right?
Right,
Devin has a point to me.
Also, what's our,
We're over.
stopping and switching?
We're still good. We have 7 more minutes.
So there's cooling pizza in the other room, just to really mess with your head.
We should announce that we have, through a generous last minute improvisational donation.
And selfish because I wanted food. A law firm training, expanded. Hungry attorneys are bad attorneys. I figure we'll have a better, slightly full belly fueled final discussion for the group is what my goal was, but anyhow. I think your point of accuracy hits on many things we've been talking about, last day and a half, which is context, right? Credit scoring. What you brought up is exactly the issue, right? If all my data says immigrants from India who are male and get their degree in cyber are also most likely to go buy a car that is really fast and get into accidents. Okay, is this vaguely based on someone I know? Yes. Well, the industry is going to say, but I'm accurate at assessing risk. And that's a really extra, but it also could be diagnostic. Could it be, we've been redlining forever, and so a whole group, of course they have less wealth and are disadvantaged because we treat them like crap forever, right? So those issues are there. But then this also gets into, if you don't let someone build a really big data set with everything in it, dear privacy people, get a clue. They're not gonna be accurate for that, as opposed to, this is not about accuracy anymore. This is about all sorts of nuance on, Socratic, what is the good? Unfortunately, and that's where news and First Amendment, I think, are a hammer, but a very different question about accuracy on certain decisions and decision-making issues and that versus, well, I'd like to aspire. And frankly, if you think about the history of media with this crew, right? TV shows, they should look more diverse. It's not accurate if you look at any medical show in terms of the racial distribution of people on that show. But people say it's important to have that. And that if we didn't have, some people argue you wouldn't have Obama if you didn't have the show 24, because it had a black president that was strong. Who knows? But those are all expressive and really different than I'm making a decision on something that has to be at least some version of ground truth, which of course will shift depending on your data set. Is that a fair statement? For you, the data set's a really big deal for ground truth.
I think from a technical perspective, it's really difficult to control the context that you're training on. There's just no robust, reliable, automatic way to do that. Using a human in the loop is just not scalable. Yes. What you're training is billions of samples. So it will take a lifetime to go through. Yeah. And it's also subjective, who is this human that's looking at these data? And experimenting with different ways to try to make this automatic costs millions of dollars because you need to train models on different setups to see what kind of works best. But it's just not worth it for companies to spend a lot of money, I guess, in my opinion. So they just aim for the accuracy. But from my perspective, it's up to us to kind of develop the technology to aim for that aspiration of accuracy while also making it less easy for the bad boys to use this for malicious intentions. And that's what we try to do.
Okay, let's do 2 more interventions before we wrap. So Andrew and then Carmen. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm a master's student here at electrical and computer engineering. This is more of a surface level question about the research results that people believe sources that they trust for standards and are familiar with. And this isn't exactly coupled to AI, but there was a notion, I think around 2016, that some demographics would basically believe anything they see on Facebook. It's a very way concern. Is that different from this? Is that, was that, was that not true in research, or is that a different context from what was observed with the AI?
No, I think that is, that's been observed in the Ukraine area. I'm thinking of Marshmeyer's, Marshmeyer, excuse me. His work. No, sorry. No. Where, you know, there are certain demographics that, you know, their perceptions and beliefs about the political systems that they're in are going to change. And so, in fact, that even strengthens the case for using kind of traditional media, using the channels that they've always paid attention to continually reinforce those perceptions and beliefs. So yeah, there's merit to that.
Last point.
Yes, this has been a fascinating conversation, by the way. I'm like feeling so triggered, as somebody who's working with you mind on like content moderation.
Come clean. Did the trust and safety work at Google. Having a proxy.
Machine learning fairness.
Yes. I mean, like just to pick up an example of you know, like racial slurs, like, you know, one of the things that classic moderation algorithms couldn't tell was context. So we had cases where like Google Groups and Meta, Facebook had Facebook groups around Black Lives Matter. You know, they're like literally auto banning and removing accounts who were people who were describing their experience of racism because the system was so bad at context. Now, like modern LLMs are like slightly better, you know, with that transform architecture and attentional. You need that kind of sort of ability to pick context, but it's still a misconception they do. And I think what we're hitting on really is like this challenge of trying to govern technologies that are increasingly being sold and marketed as context-less. You know, we can't say anything about bias or performance or accuracy about something where we don't understand how it's meant to be used. Your examples are fantastic. Like, I think your examples highlight that, you know, what's the default that a system that's being sold like this should be performing as. But if, you know, should a user be able to override that and kind of have a prompt about an Arab mother describe making lasagna instead. This is so, it's, you know, those are kind of, I think, really interesting examples that show that the tendency to bias. But to me, the bigger question is, it's so hard to really understand what the right solution is if you don't understand the contextual use case of a user. And I think that's kind of getting back to my point yesterday of like the way these are being sold and marketed to me feels really different. It is being sold as something where it just removes our ability to meaningfully assess or evaluate these because we're evaluating them for further higher order abstract conceptions of accuracy or reliability, not something that's specific enough to say, as I think Cody Barrett's getting out of, like, do we know how the system works and what it's being used for? I actually think that's a fascinating, actually it's like really inspiring that this SCOTUS is picking up in this, because to me that feels like the issue.
Oh, yeah, no, and you think about there are really three levels as they talk about. One, okay, here's the algorithm, it simply directly implements my decision. So that's gonna be protected. Then we go to, here's the algorithm, and then that's her first level concern. I guess the next one is, well, what if it just, the algorithm is designed to do whatever you do, not implement our community standards? And then the third layer out then is, what if we turn it over to the AI tool, and the AI tool is deciding what is going to be removed, what is hate speech, something subjective like that. Yeah, so yeah, they're thinking about it, and then you get the secret algorithm part too. They don't understand what's going on, and it bothers them before they make any broad pronouncements. And I think I kind of get that. Yeah. And we, by the way, we think you're cool in a positive sense.
We're all very fair. Yes.
You're wow. Hey, are you paying my way? Oh yeah, you're very.
Carmen, do you have any?
Oh, no, I just forgot to put mine down. Sorry about that.
Okay, so unless we have any other comments, I think this has been a terrific 2-day proceeding. So thank you all very much for coming.